It's always dangerous to clap before the talk because you may wish to retract your clapping even though there will not be an opportunity to do so. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In the name of God, who is the loving nurturer of the creation and the all-compassionate. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, and all praise be to God, who is the Lord of all realities, of all worlds. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina Muhammad, and may God's blessings and salutations be upon our Prophet Muhammad al-Mustafa, God's chosen and God's beloved, the one who was sent as Khatam al-Nabiyyin, the one who was sent to seal, to verify, to affirm and confirm what all the prophets before him brought and taught. And the one who was sent as nothing illa rahmatan lil alameen, as nothing but a token of God's love to everyone and to everything. May God's blessings be upon him. May God's blessings be upon his family, who sacrificed so much for the sake of standing for vulnerable people, for the sake of standing up against corrupt power, for the sake of standing for the spiritual essence of this faith of ours. We ask for God's blessings to be upon them. We ask for God's blessings to be upon all of the righteous and true companions who similarly sacrificed everything that they had hoped to win or achieve for themselves, sacrificed everything so that one day we might be able to inherit this religion intact and write our own chapter of Islamic history. So we must be grateful to all of them. We must ask for God's blessings upon all of them, just as we ask for God's blessings to be upon all of the messengers, those whose names we know and those whose names we do not know, and for God's blessings to be upon their families and upon all of their righteous and true companions. Okay, and Abed is making strange gesticulations. Okay, they're making strange. Okay, good. I'm reading the signs then. Oh God. Whenever we speak about a great figure from history, and most especially the great religious founders, the great religious figures of history, we're always faced with a dilemma. Because we will never be able to remove all of the filters of theology and history and get to know Muhammad ibn Abdullah, the one whom we celebrate as God's prophet, alayhi salatu wassalam. We will never be able to access him outside of those filters of tradition and ways of thinking about him. And so there really is no way for us to come to some kind of objective, documentary-like understanding of who he was before the canons of Islam, before the filters of theology came into being and became operative. And so it's true that Muhammad, like any of the great figures, Jesus, Moses, any of those great figures, Muhammad then becomes like a mirror for us. And what we see, how we look in that mirror, tells us as much about ourselves as it does about the person upon whom we gaze. And so tonight we will ponder the Prophet Muhammad. May God's blessings and salutations be eternally upon him. We will look upon him as a mirror. And we will situate ourselves honestly. We know in the contemporary academy that there really is no such thing as objectivity. And so if I'm looking into this mirror with hate in my heart, I'm going to see things that justify my hatred. And if I look into this mirror with love in my heart, I'm going to see elements that deepen and increase and inflame my love. And so tonight, knowing that objective analysis of this incredible man objective analysis is beyond anyone's reach, no matter how much we want to fool ourselves. But tonight we want to just be honest about the fact that we are looking back now from a place of love, from a place of gratitude, and from a place of faith. And it means that we don't have to apologize for looking upon the Prophet Muhammad with love and with gratitude and with faith. And it doesn't mean that we have to sacrifice truth. It doesn't mean that we have to sacrifice the historical record in order to do so. And so tonight, with your permission and in your presence, I would really like just to gaze into the mirror of the Prophet Muhammad, upon him be peace, and share what I see. So when I look into the mirror of Muhammad, alayhi salatu wassalam, I see a man who was idealistic, a man who was a believer in causes. And I think of the time in his own life when a foreign worker was being abused in Mecca, and how he teamed together with other young men to stand against the respected and wealthy Meccan uncle, and to do something which was culturally foreign and culturally insolent, culturally unsavory, uncouth, and to stand against the esteemed Meccan uncle and to demand justice for the worker. This was something that they called Half al-Fudul, the alliance of the virtuous. And even though it was an insolent act in its own culture and its own day, it was something that he was so proud of, and this was long before prophecy. It was something that he was so proud of that even as an older man after prophecy, he said, that was such a good thing we did to get wages and justice for that foreign worker. That was such a good thing that we did, that if a situation like that came up today, I would do it again. And so one of the things about being an idealist and being a believer in causes is that he understood that there are many ways in which we can form bonds with one another, and that there is never any prohibition about working side by side, regardless of our religious beliefs and regardless of our life situations. There is nothing ever to prevent us working side by side for the cause of justice. And so, as I think about what that meant in his own day, and I think about what it means in our day, there's no question that we live in a time when we need the idealism and the energy of youth. We see the protests happening in every continent and almost in every country. And instead of warring against the young, angry people who see the world in such a broken and unjust, wrong state, instead of criticizing them, we should come to their aid with counsel and with support, remembering that our beloved Mustafa, our beloved Prophet himself, was a great idealist and a believer in causes. When I look into the mirror of Muhammad, I see a man who allowed the people around him to have a voice. And even though he lived in a very patriarchal or male-dominated society, that also meant for him listening to the voices of strong women that were in his family and in his community. We know that we live in a world where many voices are being silenced. We know right now, with more than 1 million people, more than 1 million Muslims incarcerated in China, we know that the voices are being silenced through sheer economic and military power and threat. And we know that there are so many other venues in the world, not just where Muslims' rights are being abused and people are trying to cleanse the land and the culture of any trace of Muslim presence, but we know that there are many places in the world where human rights, the rights of religious minorities, even sometimes in Muslim majority lands, where people's rights are being trampled upon and their very identity is being erased, and the world is silent, and we are silent. It may not be politically expedient for us. It may be that we're worried about creating a social justice profile on Facebook. It may be that there are lots of good reasons why we silence ourselves or we silence others. But the man whom we celebrate tonight was a man who allowed people to have their voice and listen deeply to what their voices had to tell him and had to tell the world. When I look into the mirror of Muhammad, I see a man who respected other religions. Even though he believed himself to be the recipient of revelation, that did not prevent him from seeing the wisdom, seeking the wisdom even sometimes, of people coming from other faith traditions and honoring them and seeking their friendship and sometimes their alliance. So I remember how the very first Muslim delegation, historians can debate whether it was a group of people who needed protection or whether it was his first foreign delegation. But I remember how he sent them to a trusted Christian king in Habash in Ethiopia because of the reputation of the righteousness of this Christian king. And I remember how much later, when news of the death of that king came to him in Medina, how he offered the Islamic funeral prayers for that deceased king. And I remember how he allowed people to pray, delegations to pray in their own way. I remember how when he and the first Muslims landed in Medina on the day of Yom Kippur, he found the Jewish community fasting on the 10th day of the first month of the year. What we call Ashura, what the Jewish community calls Yom Kippur, because in those days the Arabic calendar, the Arabian calendar, and the Jewish calendar were the same. So on the 10th day of the first month of the new year, he found the Jewish community fasting, and he said, it was such a good thing. And so the Muslim community fasted with the Jewish community. And then later on, when the fasting of the month of Ramadan was decreed, the fasting on the 10th day of the first month became an optional thing. But it has ever been with us as a communal practice. And it began as a day of solidarity of fasting with the Jewish community. And so we live in a world right now where people are demonized because of their faiths, where sometimes even Muslims growing up don't learn a respectful word for the religious other. They just learn the word kafir. And that has all kinds of problems academically and exegetically when it comes to taking this word from its pre-Islamic Arabian context and applying it to temple-going Buddhists or Hindus or Jews or Christians. It's a terrible mistake. And we forget about the fact that the Prophet whom we love and whom we celebrate tonight was a man who not only did he tolerate other faith communities, but he cherished their presence. And we must remember too that his first religious counsel came from the cousin of his beloved wife, Khadija. And so his first spiritual counsel, let's say, as he was beginning to journey through the very rough psychological and emotional terrain of this revelation experience, that first counselor came from another faith tradition. When I look into the mirror of Muhammad ﷺ, I see an environmentalist. I see a man who is deeply concerned about the environment. I see a man who is deeply concerned about animals and insects. I see a man who said that a single act of mercy to an animal, even an animal that is much disparaged, like the dog in Arabia, a single act of mercy could win one a place in paradise. I see a man who is very concerned about conserving water. I see a man who made it very clear that even in the worst moments, even in moments of conflict, the sacredness of the environment could never be transgressed, could never be violated. So when I look into the mirror of Muhammad, I see someone who very much raises a challenge for us today in a world where the trust of the creation has been so terribly violated. And we are now beginning to deal with the consequences of that violation. Somehow we've lost the consciousness that we were placed here as the caretakers, and we've just become the takers, the exploiters of the creation. And when we look into the mirror of Muhammad, we see someone who challenges that way of being, that way of consuming, that greed, that commodification of the sacred trust of nature. And we see someone who truly lived his life in a way that understood that nature was God's first book given to humankind, woven of the same ayat that our sacred text of the Quran is woven. When I look into the mirror of Muhammad, I see someone who understood that forgiveness was one of the most powerful weapons in our spiritual armory. I remember how he rode into Mecca after many years of these people trying to obliterate him, to annihilate him, to kill him, to wipe out his monotheistic movement. And how he rode into Mecca and the people were expecting the worst. And when they asked him, "What will you do with us now?" he said, "Today I will say to you what Joseph said to his brothers," reminding us of another time, another sacred story within the Quran, that today there is no blame upon you. And in that moment, a man who could have exacted vengeance upon the people that had been trying to kill him and wipe out his movement. In that day, those people were won over. And Mecca became an Islamic city in a moment because of that magnanimity and that understanding that forgiveness is the higher path that God calls us all to. And we look at the world today, and we look at the grievances that we carry, and we think of how powerful this teaching is for us. This idea of forgiveness with no grudges. This liberating teaching. And this is a teaching that we could spend many evenings exploring and thinking about. When I look at the mirror of Muhammad, I see a man who was an ethnic egalitarian. Most cultures have a sense of supremacism, and it doesn't really show until it comes time for the children to get married, and then it kind of comes out. That, oh, well, we were not thinking of exactly that kind of Muslim for you, or no, well, we weren't exactly, but he was an ethnic egalitarian where he himself, and we know that even after him, the great, I want to say the great sin, but the great offense of Arab supremacism rose its ugly head almost as soon as he died, alayhi salatu wassalam. And the early caliphate became an Arab supremacist state. We know that cultural force was so strong it resurfaced after his death. But while he lived, he did not discriminate and truly lived according to his own teaching, that in this community there would be no Arab and there would be no non-Arab. And he was a man who embraced and accepted people as full human beings and full members of his community, regardless of whether they had been slaves or from foreign cultures, or slaves and from foreign cultures. And obviously today we live in a world where that is not the status quo. We live in a world today where we judge and are judged according to the color of our skin, according to our gender, according to whatever difference we may possess or we may carry, differences of sexual orientation or of gender identity, all these differences. But we live in a world where ethnic nationalism is on the rise. We don't just see it south of the border, it's alive and well in this country. We see it happening in Europe. We see it happening in Asia. We see it happening in many parts of the world. And it is a sickness, a tribalistic sickness that our faith and our prophet sought to heal and sought to guide us beyond. And so when I look into the mirror of Muhammad, I see someone who defied that reality in his own day, that cultural reality in his own day, and who continues to challenge us to live in this spirit today. When I look at the Prophet Muhammad, when I look into the mirror of Muhammad, I see a man who is not afraid to help at home. Now, I'm not even going to go there, because I don't want to go into too much detail, because I don't want people to come to me afterwards and say, excellent speech, brother, you just made one mistake. He's helping at home. Yeah, that happens all the time. But this was a man who was not afraid to roll up his sleeves and help at home. And of course, in a world where patriarchy is sadly still relevant and still alive in the world, this is a challenge to all of us in this room, all of the men in this room, that masculinity, the masculinity that he symbolizes is not a masculinity that resists dishes in the sink or other domestic duties at home. When I look into the mirror of Muhammad, I see a man who saw the centrality of love in religion. There are many ways in which we could talk about this. But of course, we all know the prophetic statement where the prophet is reported to have said, and according to many different traditions, so this is a very strongly verified statement, that not a single one of you is truly a believer until and unless you love for your brother what you love for yourself. And this is his own Arabic rendering of the Golden Rule. And I don't think he was only talking about the brothers, but this idea that to be a true person of faith requires that we place other people, their well-being, their survival, their dignity, at least on a par with our own. And when I love my brother or my sister for myself, it doesn't mean that I get to choose what they love. It means I love for them the freedom to have their own passions, their own gifts, and to pursue those gifts according to their own desire and according to their own strategic plan. And so for me to love another as I love myself means that we must learn as a spiritual community, we must learn to go beyond our petty notions of love. These notions of love which seek to get something back for me from you. So I love you so that I can get what I want from you. But this idea of loving as God loves, this love that seeks only your happiness, your well-being, and your flourishing. And that, to witness your flourishing, to witness your well-being, that becomes my reward. Because I love that for you. We also know that he is celebrated in the Quran as a token of God's love. And we've talked about this many times here from here, from there, and from upstairs. But this idea of love as rahmah, we translate it often as mercy in English, but really I've come to believe that this is the highest articulation of love in the Quran. Just as wisdom is the highest articulation of knowledge, rahmah is the highest articulation of love, and it is linguistically connected to the most powerful and most visceral form of love That is the love of the mother for her child. Because the name Ar-Rahman and Ar-Rahim, those two names, as well as the word itself, Rahmah, come from that three-letter Arabic equation, which really means the uterus, the womb in which our lives began. And so these names of Rahman and Rahim and this noun of Rahmah really conjure up the idea of a love that is unconditional, a love that is nurturing, a love that is protective, and a love that is absolutely the fact and not something that can be earned or deserved. It's the fact that the mother comes to love that child long before that child is seen, long before that child is named, long before that child has done anything to deserve that love. The love is just the fact. And this is why when we read in the sacred hadiths, the hadith Qudsiyah, that when a believing person takes a step toward God, God is taking 2 steps toward the believer. When the believer is walking toward God, God is rushing toward the believer. Whenever we mention God, God is mentioning us. Whenever we mention God in an assembly, God is mentioning us in an assembly. This reciprocity of us remembering God and God remembering us, and this longing, which we will never understand, this longing that God has for us to come home to well-being, to come home to God, to come home to dignity. This longing that God has is at the very core of this kind of love that the prophet exemplified and the prophet taught. And so when I look into the mirror of Muhammad, I see a man who understood very clearly the centrality of love in the religious life. When I look into the mirror of Muhammad, I see a man who was willing to fight if and when necessary, but a man who always sought to bring peace out of conflict and to establish peace. And he understood very clearly that conflict should lead to peace. And if it doesn't, then it is a kind of conflict which is not in the service of faith. It's in the service of our own greed and our own lesser natures, lower natures. And we live at a time now where the moral high ground in almost every conflict on the earth has been lost. We live at a time when we are developing weapons that break every rule of Islamic jurisprudence pertaining to war. That we live in a time when we are fighting absolute wars that seem to be endless and that serve no higher purpose. And so when we look into the mirror of Muhammad, we should not glamorize or lionize the prophet on the battlefield. But we should glamorize and lionize the man who at the very first moment he was able made treaties of non-aggression, made treaties of peace, made treaties of coexistence, even when his own companions and disciples wanted to keep fighting. Even then, he entered into negotiations and agreements with people that perhaps didn't deserve that consideration from him, but he saw the good of peace and the importance of negotiation and treaty. When I look into the mirror of Muhammad, I see tremendous audacity and courage. We think just the very fact that his early revelations led to his first prophetic act, which was to go into Mecca and deliver a message that he knew would be absolutely opposed by everyone he knew. This idea of letting go of the polytheistic way of being, letting go of the polytheistic pilgrimage and all the money it made for Mecca and all the value of contacts it brought to the Meccans and to the Quraysh, his own relatives, and to preach an unpopular message. When I look into the mirror of Muhammad, I also see a man who was vulnerable, a man who was an orphan, a man who was a social outcast, and a man who was economically boycotted for many years, a man who was a very troubled soul, remembering that when the revelations began, he went home to his beloved wife Khadija, who was wise and gave him counsel, and then took him to meet her cousin and helped him process what was happening. But when we look at the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, we begin to understand that the reflection in this mirror is reminiscent of the story of Joseph, who of course was thrown into a well and sold into slavery and falsely accused of a crime that he didn't commit and thrown into prison and had to endure all of these indignities, all of these things before God raised him to a position of power and influence. So we understand in this image of Muhammad that we see for ourselves. We understand that it is not about the power of the human person. It is not about the miraculous powers of this chosen man, this beloved of God, this seal of the prophets. It's not about his personal power, but it was about his willingness to allow God to do something powerful through him and with him. And so when we look into the mirror of Muhammad, there's much we see that challenges us, that inspires us, that gives us the courage and the audacity to face the challenges of today. And everyone in this room knows that we are facing challenges that rival the challenges that humanity has faced at any other time in history. And this is a time when we need that courage. This is a time when we need that love. This is a time when we desperately need that forgiveness. This is a time when we desperately need to protect and defend the sacredness of the creation. This is a time when we desperately need to be working together, whether it's at home or whether it's outside the home, with people of our faith or with peoples of other faiths, with people who love as we love or with people who love differently than we love. This is a time when we desperately need to be inclusive of other people's voices, especially those who have been marginalized and silenced by oppressors and by sometimes our oppressive culture. This is a time when we need to be idealistic. And we need to trust that somehow, some way, as bad as it gets, and as bad as it may be right now, that somehow, some way, God has a plan. And just as he himself faced moments that seemed hopeless, we need to take courage when we face our own moments of hopelessness. So tonight is a night when we are not trying to recreate the legacy of Muhammad. It's not a night when we're trying to argue against those who gaze into that same mirror and see ugliness or see hatred. But it's a night as a community of faith, as a community of love. It's a night when we look into that mirror and we see the food for our souls. We see inspiration and we see challenge and we see love. We see a kind of love which spans the years, a kind of love which spans our ethnicities and our languages, a kind of love that crosses over and into every difference that we may have. And so tonight is a night when we call upon him as not just God's beloved, but as our beloved. It's a night of celebration and a night of love. And we ask for God's blessings and prayers to be upon him. We ask for God's blessings to be upon all those whom he loved. As he said one time, that I loved Khadija, and I will love anyone who loved Khadija. And we ask for God's blessings to be upon all those who love him. And in the spirit of his magnanimity, we also ask for God's blessings to be even upon those who do not love him, and yet whose hearts truly are crying out to experience the kind of love that he embodied and that he exemplifies even now across so many centuries and in such a distant and foreign land. Assalamu alaikum and thanks so much.
Alaikum salam.